So again, my name's Dan. I am the event and volunteer coordinator for Bellefontaine Cemetery. Let me see if I can get it a little away. First thing people ask me all the time, beyond the proper pronunciation, which is Bellefontaine, what's the best time to come to the cemetery? And what I'm trying to illustrate with these images is there's no really bad season. One of my favorite, and don't take this personally, is when there's nobody there at the cemetery during the winter and we get a nice light snowfall. It's very, very quiet and peaceful. So we have a little moniker at the cemetery, and it's going to fit very well into this conversation tonight because we have 87,000 burials at the cemetery, but not every person has a marker. And of the 87,000, about 15% are unmarked. So I always like to say where every stone tells a story, however, not every story has a stone. And sometimes the not marking is intentional. During the Jim Crow era, African Americans would choose not to mark because it puts a bullseye on their family as having wealth. Not unusual for us to have an African American family buried at the cemetery at that point. They will only use their last name and then initials on the individual names, or no marker whatsoever. German free thinkers are notorious for not marking as well. Part of their belief system is that if their life's endeavors do not warrant memory, stones should not be put in place. And then there's the infamous thing about St. Louis, and I'm going to take you back to 1849 when we were created. If you're a family of 5 on a steamship arriving to St. Louis and your entire family catches cholera, who's responsible for your burial? The steamboat. And they would sell your belongings, offset their cost, and if there was any remainder, they would send those monies off to families. And it would be up to them to send monies back for monumentation. How often do you think that happened? So we are going to talk about iconography tonight, the symbolism of the cemetery. And before I go any further, I have to tell you, and she'll get mad at me, but Sandy Schneider is out in the audience. She's one of our wonderful volunteers. And I would be remiss if I did not point out Sandy Peters, who is here, who is one of our wonderful board members. If it wasn't for our volunteers, I couldn't do half the things we do at the cemetery. And they were really the production behind this piece. We were created in 1849 as one of the first garden cemeteries in the United States and the first one west of the Mississippi. And this is a departure from the graveyard system of burial to the cemetery. And so when you see the term cemetery, you're being more inclusive. Graveyards are, for the most part, religiously or municipality-based. So you'd have a Methodist graveyard or city of graveyard. And that clearly identifies who's going to be laid within. But once you're using the term cemetery, you're being more inclusive. So, another St. Louis misconception. Calvary has never been exclusively Catholic. When they were created in 1854, sections 1 through 4 were for Catholics, 5 through 8 were for non-Catholic Christians. So if you had a blended marriage of a Catholic and a Baptist, you could still be in an archdiocese cemetery. So they are technically a non-denominational cemetery. We, in comparison, are non-sectarian, meaning we've had all beliefs and non-beliefs since 1849. So that includes Orthodox Jewish, Muslim, Feng Shui, every flavor of Christianity. Yes, we let the Catholics in. So gravestones and monuments are basically, as Michelle said, basically the emojis of the time. And here's this real simple truth to it. In today's money, $15 a letter for an engraved letter, $45 for a raised letter on a monument. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and if you just do the math, you'll see that there is a positive aspect to using images to convey information. So just real quick, some things you might see, and everybody asks me, so I'm just going to jump right into it. One of my favorite is Tempus Fugit. If you remember your Latin, that is time flies. I always like to ask the kids today when they come in, how would you depict time flying? And they're, always talking about a watch with wings or something like that. I'm like, what about before watches and clocks? So Tempus Fugit, time flies, is an hourglass with wings. We had the broken oak tree, the lily of the valley, and then anything that's circular is recanting the same thing, that there is really no beginning, no end. Everything circles back around. So when we go to the broken tree, this is basically communicating to you that, yes, they lived a full life and they actually planted the next generation because they have the acorn up there But this particular life has come to an end. This tree has stopped, but there are other generations coming. Time flies is the reminder that life is fleeting for all of us. We never know how many days we have on this globe, and to live each day to the fullest. Lily of the valley and many of the flowers have a lot to do with resurrection and Christ's resurrection. So the fact that there is, again, renewal, especially in spring. And as I was saying, with anything that has a circular format, just the circle itself is that, the end of winter means that spring is coming. And so there is a fulfillment. Now, this is where you can actually even, before you get into the image itself, kind of grade what year you're talking about by the mindset of the individual. So the death heads are from 1720s into the late 1700s, and is a particular aspect of death that you and I don't want, and that is the grim reaper, hell and high water, the fires of hell. And we start getting into a Victorian era where infant mortality is very high. And so I want you to think about taking your child to a cemetery where a little brother or little sister is going to be, and seeing this, and how you would potentially scare the child. So at the end of this era, going into the Victorian era, what you'll see is the death heads give way to the cherub. And so now when you take the child, because in a family of 7, 2 of those children do not see the age of 13, the little brother, little sister who was passed is now in a much more pleasant environment in death than what you would have seen in the death heads. Doesn't scare you as much, right? And then the cherubs kind of take place, and you'll see them here, there, and everywhere, if you venture out to our cemetery. The willow tree, this is the one that really kind of gets me, is people expect to see willow trees in cemetery. They are not high on our list, even as an arboretum. They are a pain in the ass to keep up with. But willow trees on monumentation are a sign of continued weeping, perpetual mourning, and things of that nature. Just by its sheer look and the name of it, it's weeping. So this is a family that's in a perpetual state of mourning. We'll talk a little bit about this, but whenever you see urns, it's hearkening back to the Roman era where pretty much everybody was cremated. Not to say that there are cremains in that urn, that an urn is associated with death, dying in the cemetery. We'll see that again with some of the Egyptian motifs. So very proud of this photograph. So on the right-hand side, we have an actual Victorian service taking place, and here is a recreation that was done at Bellefontaine Cemetery just a handful of years ago. And the Victorian era, as you're seeing, when enough was never enough. So they took things to the nth degree, but everything had a meaning, nothing arbitrary in that Victorian era. So even when you get into a house that is being remodeled and you see those wonderful dental moldings up on top, that is for a purpose. You have coal, and that coal dust is basically going up the wall, and that dental molding is meant to trap that before it gets to your ceiling, so you don't have to clean the ceiling as well. So all of those things have particular meanings to them. Same thing here. So we have grieving women, which again we call perpetual mourners. The upright torch is seen in and out of the cemetery, but the inverted or downturned torch is exclusive to the cemetery and means that the light of life has been extinguished, but with an inverted flame still burning, the immortal soul continues on. They're leaving you a message, basically saying, don't look for me here, I have gone on to whatever that other belief may be. Broken columns can be a couple of different things to different people. Most of the time, it is a life interrupted. And this is up to your interpretation at some time. So it can be somebody who died young, but it can also be an architect or an engineer, somebody who was doing something at the time of their death, and they did not get to complete it. And then the acanthus leaves are something that we get from the Middle East. Acanthus, which does grow here in the States, not as well, but very much found over there, is kind of an evergreen type plant. And it's also prickly and supposed to mimic life as well, being kind of a prickly journey. Wreaths, and again, you get even into the aspect of the specifics on horticulture that olives are peace or victory, cypress is mourning. But the wreath is meant to, again, remind you, remember the circle, that though there is death here, that spring will come, there will be new life, new children will be born. Whenever you see the ribbons, I want you to think now about the Sturgeon witches. One witch weaved the thread of life, one measured it, and one cut it. And so when you see the ribbons in the cemetery, a lot of times it has to do with either one's wealth, the longer, the wealthier, or longevity of life. The longer the ribbon, the longer the life. And then, of course, we're mixing a couple of things with the torch and the wreath. So Egyptian, everybody seems to want to gravitate to Tutankhamun, but there are two eras of Egyptian revival, Napoleonic and then Tutankhamun. If you come to our cemetery, the Tate Mausoleum is actually Napoleonic. It's built before Napoleon. But all of these will become associated with death, dying in the cemetery. Once, especially again, Tutankhamun's tomb is found, and this is kind of revisited. So everything associated with Egyptian symbology has a connection to death, dying in the cemeteries. My favorite is the eagle. The sphere in the middle represents your soul. The two snake heads represent good and evil present in all of us. Egyptian mythology states that your heart is removed and weighed against the weight of a feather. If you are full of anger and angst, your heart is heavier than the feather. Your journey is over. But if you are lighthearted, full of love and joy, your journey continues into the next realm. The symbols are not for the dead. The symbols are for the living. And you have to take this back to a time when, especially at a garden cemetery like twice a month, the family came in on Sunday. The young and the old would go off and learn what you're learning now. Those that could tend the family yard would take care of the plant material that was there. And the Victorians heavily planted on their graves. They'd put ivy and woody plant material on male graves, flowering on feminine. And that is why most of the stones in Bellefontaine Cemetery are actually footstones. Because if you did a tombstone with vegetation, your vegetation blocks the text. So the use of the footstone is predominant. And that's a part of iconography, because you don't want to be talking to the wrong point of the body, right? So if it's a headstone, you're back here. If it's footstone, and a lot of times those footstones may have words that they wish you to speak over the grave. They're inviting you to kind of belly up to the bar. This starts tipping my age. How many of you guys remember the original Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston? Do you remember what was on the fin? Alpha to Omega. So this symbology has always been around. The fun little tidbit, and again, I have no way of proving this or not, but this is a picture of the Tate Mausoleum Sphinx at Bellefontaine. And the rumor is that Frank Tate posed for this himself. So he's basically, and he was a showman, so I'm sure that there's some validity in that. But many of the contemporaries who come out on tour think it looks like Bill Clinton. All right, the obelisk, and this goes way back to Napoleon. Egyptians had the obelisk, and for them, it is an inverted ray of sun and homage to the sun god Ra. And that, again, was their faith belief. But then Napoleon drugged one from Egypt to Europe, and the predominantly Christians, of course, had no need for Ra. So they have to retool this. And so this is my forewarning to you that icons can mean different things to different peoples. And so it's always important to take your iconography together with your genealogy. Together, they will tell you a more clear and precise story. One without the other only gives you half of the tale. But once this is taken up to Europe, the Christians get going, and they want this to be a reminder. It's a barometer. And the statement is that when born, we are far from God and somewhat undefined. As we grow closer to God, become more connected with our spiritual self, we become more focused and defined, and that point represents when man and God are in the same realm of existence. Especially at Bellefontaine Cemetery, where we have at least 5,000 obelisks, you are to check yourself on your spiritual journey. Where are you on your journey? Are you just beginning or you're nearing the top. And this has nothing to do with age. This has everything to do with your spiritual well-being and connection. Are you ready for what comes next? Columns, for the most part, show strength and stability. And then, as I like to say, this family has less money than this family. Because once you start getting into details and accoutrements, it is more time at the mason's shop, and so they are a little bit more expensive. But we have strength and stability. You have two of them here with the swag that is definitely identifying a male and a female who have come together. But the devil is in the details. How are you guys at spelling? Good spellers? I'm going to start you on the name Morrow. M-O-R-R. And you forgot something. What's there? What's right there? Period, meaning there are no males to carry on the Morrow family name. Now again, you marry that with genealogy to prove that out. And 90% of the time at the cemetery, we are able to prove that out. But we've also found some individuals who were significant at the time of their death, and maybe they were working on something, and so the family is identifying. So again, this is raised. That's $45. They're not just putting it there because it looks pretty. It's there to convey some type of message. And that's the same way with all the iconography. Wheat shocks identify a well-lived life and a full harvest. And so this can mean one of two things. It can mean that they lived past their 75th year in Victorian times. That's kind of the high water mark. Men are, 50, 55, women 60, 65. So if you hit 75, you might get the wheat shock, or you might get that because you had 12 kids. Full harvest. Ivy, evergreen, always identifying that their love is forever. They will be remembered forever. I kind of already talked about the lilies, which we repeat in a couple of different ways. And then the palm fronds are a forewarning. And I say that because, again, you have to remember where you are. There is a particular type of palm frond that you will find in Christian cemeteries to denote Christianity, but there is another type of palm frond you will find in Jewish cemeteries. So if you're in a Christian cemetery and you see a palm frond, you can pretty much identify that they are telling you that they are Christian. If you go to a Jewish cemetery and you see a palm frond, they are not telling you they're Christian. Okay? So you got to remember, you got to put this into the context of where you are. Again, you can get into all kinds of details. And again, the whole idea of this presentation is not to tell you everything there is to know about iconography, but just to kind of scrape the surface. Michelle Thomas, who I mentioned before, came to us with a database of 400 images and what they mean. That database has now grown to 800 images. And we're trying to figure out the best way to convey that in some way, shape, or form. But the thistle, for those that have Celtic or Scottish ancestry, that's, again, cemetery humor. Dead giveaway that we've got a Celt in there. Roses are one of those things, and unfortunately, many times done on some of these original marble and limestone, and they're hard to read. But if you see a full bloom rose broken, that is somebody who lived to an adult age and then died. If you see a bud broken, that is a child or an adolescent. The one you really want to look for, and I've only seen one, and unfortunately it was not good enough to take an image of, was a full rose broken with a rosebud off of it, identifying that that mother and child died during pregnancy. Ferns, again, another forever and green aspect. So there are some redundancies. Dogwoods, if you did not know, again, Christian. A lot of people seem to miss this. In some Christian beliefs, the wood of the cross was a dogwood. And then it was supposed to never be able to grow to full measure again, so that another cross could not be made from it. Children. And this is where, again, this is not the era that we live in today. The Victorians felt very strongly, though separated in life by death, they would be together forever in the next realm. For every 7 children born, 2 would not see the age of 13. For every 7 women in pregnancy, 1 would not make it through pregnancy. So they are confronted with this on a regular basis. And so the idea of a sleeping child is more palatable than a child that has passed. And so you'll see many times where they are resting or appear to be sleeping. The lambs, this is the one that kind of gets me because everybody always thinks it's an infant. No, it's a child 13 and under. So a lamb could be for a 12-year-old. It's an innocent. And then the shoes. The shoes almost always has one turned to the side. Because, have you ever gone into a kid's room? Have they ever had both shoes up? No, they're telling you that we will not see this image anymore in our house. And then Freddie and Russell over here are an example from our cemetery. And we know that both children, both boys, both brothers died within just a matter of a month of one another of typhoid when one of those typhoid things went through. And so they are showing the other children who survived that their brothers are together and not beating one another. They're playing nice. Really interesting thing, and this really goes for the genealogist because sometimes these markers can convey a lot of material, especially if you remember that our census came out every 10 years. And if you had a child who did not live to see one of those censuses, they might not exist unless you see him at the cemetery. Now, one died in 69, one died in 73, so there's a 4-year gap. And that means that they did this well after the second one, and they are acknowledging the first one. And I like pointing out on this that they have the two lambs facing one another. They're facing in, they're sharing, they're together. They're not looking out from it. And then the most important thing from a genealogical standpoint is it's got mom and dad's name on it. Not typical of most monuments to have the parents' name on. All right, so this is kind of a two-slider to prove to you that iconography never went away. So the empty chair, which I will tell you at Bellefontaine, we do not have one. These are very much found much more east of us. But an empty chair is identifying a child that has passed. And I always kind of associate this with Charles Dickens and Tiny Tim in the stool in the corner. Same idea. And in this one, you actually even merge the shoes and the chair, identifying that a child is left. And then somebody left a piece of plush up there. How many of you have been to the Murrow Building in Oklahoma City? That's their memorialization. So you have two size chairs, all empty. But when you see the smaller chair, that is depicting the children that were killed in the daycare center there. So again, the iconography of the cemetery comes into memorialization and back and forth. Not unusual for it to roll back and forth. So I talked about the urns before, but there's so much more going on here. And the one that everybody asks me about is the cloth. The cloth can be read one of two ways. If you see a cloth with clearly identified tassels on each corner, that is the curtain that separates this realm from the next. But when you find the cloth without, this is a family that's in a perpetual state of mourning. They're kind of trying to tell you something a lot of times. Either that they have not many children to mourn them in the future, and so they're in a perpetual state of mourning, or something significant happened at the point in time of this memorialization. So I always say that when you see the curtain, you really want to pay just a little bit more attention. The other thing that's down here is, remember our broken tree from early in our presentation? You can see the acorns down there, and they are letting you know there is another generation coming. So that begs some question as far as we're getting some mixed signals. Well, we know whose marker this is at the cemetery. This is Luther Kennett. Kennett, Missouri is named for him. He's one of our early mayors in St. Louis. He did have children who carried on, but he, at the time of his death, was still in the process of doing some very important projects. And the family was in kind of a perpetual state of mourning because he did not get to finish those projects. And the urns, like I said, go back to the Roman times. And with the Romans, they even have some of that vegetation or horticulture intermixed with it. Military. But then sometimes you can actually see what branch of military. Anybody want to take a guess at what Cole was? Artillery. Yeah, I mean, pretty right there in your face. This is from McCree. McCree was very early military here in St. Louis. McCree Town is kind of named for him, and so they're invoking the Roman time period. This is what, when a Roman soldier died, this is basically how they would memorialize him with his armor and all of that. And then that usually went on to the son or somebody else in the family. This is somebody who was a very important Navy man here in St. Louis. I know that sounds funny, but yes, we do have water. It's called a river. And so all of these images are associated with not just artillery, but the type of cannon you would actually see on a ship. And then it has 6 more images, I think, on around. And then I snapped this one. This might be one of those images you guys have seen. If you've ever gone out to Augusta, Missouri, made that left-hand turn onto 94, there's a cemetery there on the left-hand side. And our friend here from World War I is there to greet you. All right, before the Civil War, a burial was a burial was a burial. But the Civil War was kind of a rude wake-up call for us here in the United States. First of all, the majority of those men were put in mass graves. And then they will do General Order number 75. And it stated that those mass graves must be disinterred and they were to be given a proper burial. The Union soldiers came first, and then after the Union soldiers were done, they would go back and redo the secessionists. And that is why we have 2 different types of stone during the Civil War. The rounded top is for the Union, the pointed is for the secessionists. And if you go into a military cemetery and you see a whole sea of rounded tops, like a JB, and then you see a pointed top, I can almost guarantee you that is a prisoner of war who died while in Union custody. So even from a distance, you can tell there's a difference between these 2 individuals. Even still to this day, if we identify to the VA that we have a Civil War soldier, they will produce a marker that looks this way. And I bring that up again to brag about my wonderful volunteers who during COVID, and we had to kind of chase them off grounds because we do not have a lot of room for social distancing, they asked what they could do from home, and we gave a number of them individuals that we knew were military who hadn't been marked before. And so since COVID began, our volunteer force have secured over 50 markers for military men, and we're still in the process of putting those out. Hopefully we'll be caught up with that by the end of this season. So not memorialization so much in the cemetery, but this is how this, again, iconography can roll over into the parks and general municipal areas. So if you ever see a mounted figure and you see someone who their horse has all of their feet firmly on the ground, that means that they will have died after their military service. If you see a statue and the person on the horse has both legs up in the air, that person died in battle. And then if the horse, as I said, has all 4 legs, that they died of natural causes outside of. Now, we have another example of this at the cemetery in General Mason, who has a disassembled cannon identifying a military man who died outside of his military service. So there's never just one way to do it. There's always multiple ways to do it. All right, so this is kind of the introduction into a very important thing in genealogy that many people overlook, and that is fraternal orders. The Masons are not somebody to be afraid of. They will share what they have in their archive with you. Don't be surprised if they ask you to join, but they are more than happy to share that with you. And in Masonics especially, if you're a member, you get maybe a paragraph. But if you rise through the organization, your biography grows with your role in the Masons. And so it's not unusual for somebody like a Knights Templar to have a page and a half of a biography at the Masonic Lodge that they were a part of. Last year, for our volunteer appreciation, we were given the privilege and honor of having our event at the Scottish Rite. And they opened their files to us that we could see their photo archive of just about every single Mason that was ever here in St. Louis. So if you have a Masonic relative, you want to reach out to the Masons. They're more than happy to share this with you. To give you an idea what I'm talking about, pre-World War II in St. Louis, we had 50,000 Masons in St. Louis. Right now, we have about 5,000. But there is a sharp difference between fraternals and the woodsmen of the world, because it's not a fraternal. It's an insurance organization. You paid into the woodsman, and that guaranteed you a marker at the end of your life. Initially, it's a tree, and that tree can convey information. Every branch on the tree, all cut, would be a descendant. So if you saw a tree with 7 branches, that's 7 children. And then they kind of figured out, well, the folks paying in the same amount with a lot of kids gets a bigger marker than the guy who's paying in every month and he's got 1 kid. So inevitably, they roll back to what is just the, I'll call it a crest, to identify a woodsman. My favorite one, and we do have this at the cemetery, it is a stump that has been cut, and the axe is there with a broken handle, identifying a young man who never married, never had any children. All right, so lots of fraternal orders here. Some of them you'll recognize, the Freemasons, of course. Odd Fellows, very important one of my favorite groups. If you were in pre-colonial Britain and you had a wealthy person giving to the poor, they were considered a rather odd fellow. And then the name kind of stuck as philanthropics come to America, and they would be known as a group of Odd Fellows. And they are still, to this day, the most philanthropic of the fraternals, meaning more of their dollars go to good work and less to administrative aspects. Knights of Columbus, this is the one I want to point out. These are our friends, the Catholics, which their fraternal order iconography is disallowed in archdiocese cemeteries, even their own Knights of Columbus. So if you see a fraternal order in a archdiocese cemetery, somebody snuck something in, because that is not supposed to be per their rules and regulations. This one is very important for me because I had a great-grandfather who was a Knights of Pythias, and they were associated heavily with the Catholic Church, and they were also very heavily associated with the labor movement. And the Pope did not like that, so he gave the Pythian Brotherhood an ultimatum and said, you can stay Pythian, but you must leave the church, or you can stay with the church and find another organization. 80% of the Pythians left the Catholic Church, including my great-grandfather, who refused to go into the front door of a Catholic church, though he snuck every one of his kids in the back door to be baptized, hedging his bets. Women's societies. And this is the one that makes me mad, folks. How many people come out to the cemetery and say, ooh, that's a pentagram? No, it is an order of the Eastern Star. It is the female side of the Masons. The Daughters of Rebecca would be a Jewish organization. You even have the Pythian Sisters. This is the one I really want to point out for you guys. Do you guys notice the Knighted Daughters of the Confederacy? Check that flag. Red, white, red of stripe with a circle of stars. 7, 9, 11, and 13. If you ever see a 13-star rendition, the state of Missouri is star number 12. This is the 7-star, which is what the Daughters of the Confederacy adorn their graves with. Not this. That, as a 3x5 flag, was adopted by the Ku Klux Klan 4 years after the Civil War. It is not depicting history. It is depicting hate. The Women's Christian Temperance is an example of, again, I have to brag about the volunteers. Michelle Thomas is such a passionate person, and the challenge is always to find an icon that she hasn't seen yet. And so one day I'm out there and I saw this, what I called the cat paw. I said, I don't know what that is. Have you ever seen that before? And she got so excited to tell me that that was the Temperance Union, and that the person that we had found was kind of a big mucky muck in the temperance. She was some type of an officer in that organization. Religious symbols. This is the one that gets me, and I do tours all the time. So, you guys have a heads up because you've got the initials underneath it, but I cannot tell you how many times people come to the cemetery and says that's a Cardinals logo. Or, and I'm sure all of you thought about this, a dollar sign. But it is IHS, which is the first three letters of the name of Jesus in Greek. If you see IHC, that's the first three letters of the name of Jesus in Roman. The clasp hands I want to explain too, because most of the clasp hands we have at the cemetery are two coming horizontally. One with a cuff that's a little fancier than the other. That's depicting a husband and wife. But whenever you see the verticality, that is man meeting God in the next realm. God is reaching down to man and bringing him up. How about this one? Has nothing to do with maritime, people. Life is an ocean, and Christ is our hope, our anchor, and our salvation. 90% of the time you see an anchor in a cemetery, they're telling you they're a Christian. In Roman times, they would carve anchors into stones and walkways, and that was the pathway you were supposed to go to the next gathering of Christians. And it's a forewarning to you that these symbols are intentional for something, because what happens if you take this part of the anchor away? It's a cross. Our largest anchor at the cemetery, I'll do questions at the end. Our largest anchor at the cemetery happens to be for the John O'Fallon family. Pointing up, kind of like a mini obelisk. I have gone to a lot of cemeteries. I know that's a funny statement to make, but I've never seen a person pointing down. It's always up. And then for our Jewish friends, the Kohan hands. And if you go down to any of our Jewish cemeteries that are in and around, we'll say University City and whatnot, if you look hard enough, you'll find the Kohan hands. All right, this is where we kind of take it, again, up a notch for those that are not just religious, but really religious. What's the three initials we have here? IHC, so they are definitely on the Latin side. And then you have the 4 books of the Bible. And each of those images identify a book of the Bible. So you have Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. And they are some of the more beautifully detailed markers at the cemetery with all of this religious iconography. Lots of things mean different things. The book can actually be read one of 3 ways. If you ever go to a cemetery and you see a book opened and only a few pages turned, that is a short-lived life. If you ever see a book closed, like you see here, that is normally a well-lived life, and again, over that 75 range. When we see the book split in the middle, they almost always have text. Sometimes a psalm or a prayer. And at our cemetery, because I do have one of my wonderful researchers who's just doing the men of the cloth, and I shouldn't say that anymore because he just found a female of the cloth, they almost always are for a person of clergy. And so it's been a way for us to kind of zone in on people who are of the cloth. And then this, which some people will call a bracket, it's really, in architecture, it's flipped up the other way, and that's what holds your porches and whatnot up. But at the cemetery, they are to depict strength and stability. It's kind of a fancier version of the column. This is actually from our friends at Calvary. And seashells, I don't know if you realize this or not, but in days gone by, if you were baptized, 90% of the time you were baptized by a seashell that was used to drip the water across the child. So seashells are very much associated with children. And I don't want to say infants, but children. For those that have done genealogy and they're always frustrated with the 3-month-old who is infant Rhodes or infant whatever, that usually means that that child did not live long enough for the traveling clergy person to come and baptize them. So if you've got an older child that is still listed as infant, that means they probably were not baptized. The porcelains I want to point out, because I am, again, very mad at this, because there is no reason for a porcelain to be broken. Because the glue for that porcelain is stronger than the porcelain. I can guarantee you, anybody who's ever tried to pry one of these off, you're going to break the photograph. Leave it alone. And if you leave it alone, they'll pretty much be there forever and always. And interestingly enough, what's old is new. We are starting to see people do porcelains again. They're kind of circling back around to have an image. So, when did they stop using iconography? And hopefully you guys have paid attention enough that you know that they did not. This is my favorite Tempus Fugit. Whenever I do tours, I like to point this one out. So right there in the torch stand is Tempus Fugit. And here it comes right there. I just had the MICDS kids up, their Latin class, and we talked about Tempus Fugit for a couple of minutes. And Veni Vidi Vinci, which is iconography on Adolphus Busch. I came, I saw, I conquered. This is where you do proper genealogy. Adolphus Busch died in 1913. The mausoleum was built in 1921. Adolphus was not being pompous. I came, I saw, I conquered. His wife was protecting the memory of, as she called him, her prince. So two completely different interpretations based on, do you know when that was built? Because Adolphus didn't have anything to do with it. But here are some contemporary images. And I jumped to this one real quick to see if we've got any cardiac Cardinal fans. Anybody remember who number 8 was? This is the resting place of Larry Wilson. Died in September of 2020, so he has his number on the back, and it's a little hard to see, but that is his National Football Hall of Fame emblem. So he's letting you know. Anybody ever remember the Maze Boy? You would have seen these mazes in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in the probably 1980s, maybe in the early 90s. This is Joseph, and he used to do those by hand. And that is a solvable maze. And that was included on his marker when he passed. His father just died not too terribly long ago, and the Monument Company is doing another one with a completely different maze. Anybody want to take a guess at what this guy was? An engineer, aeronautical engineer. And then, I don't know, go back. Now I'm just popping around for fun. Darth Vader. So Marvin Whittingham is conveying quite a bit of information for you. Marvin is telling you about the passion he had with Star Wars with his son. On the right-hand side is a magnolia flower, therefore identifying the passion of horticulture he shared with his daughter. And then in the middle with the heart is basically the love he had for his wife. And so through the use of those icons, he's brought the entire family in and through. This is a relatively recent one, and sometimes we kind of forget that those stones don't just punctuate the end of a life. Sometimes they punctuate for people the end of a life that maybe was a little bit more of a struggle than it was for the rest of us. As you can see, this young man did not live a full life, but his mother was much more at ease with the concept and thought that now he would not be bound in this chair and that he would walk through the gates of heaven. So conveying some information about him, but also about where he is now. Just about to wound up. Tell you about some things. In 2024, which will be our 175th anniversary, we will be debuting our Lewis and Clark Trail. This is a combined effort between ourselves, the Missouri Botanical Garden, and Missouri History Museum. It'll be a 3/4 of a mile walking trail through a section of the cemetery that's not really suitable for full body burials, but still a unique part that we want people to be able to come and enjoy. And we'll have 5 interpretive signs, all focused on the core discovery. And each one of those signs will terminate with a QR code that will then take you either into Mobot or MoHIS and tell you more about what you started your reading with. And then this is our most recent mausoleum, which is chock-a-block full of iconography. And I'm not going to blow it because this is my hook for you to come and see us at the cemetery. But for grins and giggles, I will tell you Abraham Moeller is the person who did the lion. And that lion is about this tall compared to me. So that's a pretty sizable. And this particular mausoleum is built for 8. Okay? So whenever you come to the cemetery and do a mausoleum tour, we always talk about size based on the number of individuals who can be laid to rest there. So this is a middle-sized mausoleum by being how many people can be laid to rest. And then for those, I'm going to forewarn you, start getting your iPhones out, because if this topic is something of great interest to you, I have 2 pages here that I'll go through really slowly that will share with you some books and some additional reading you can do. But this is how detailed it can get sometimes. So does this look familiar to anybody? It's a direct knockoff of Notre Dame. At Notre Dame, those are gargoyles. But at Bellefontaine Cemetery, where this is adorning the top of Adolphus Busch's mausoleum, those are grotesques. A gargoyle must be a functional aspect, and at Notre Dame, they are downspouts. Here, it's pure ornamentation, so it's known as a grotesque. So again, we can get very, detailed. And then, the last little view of Mr. Tate, who, believe it or not, the Missouri History Museum is out there right now, and they are endeavoring a connection between this mausoleum and a guy named Houdini. So here's who I was able to secure images from. Can never make too much of an underscore for Michelle. She kind of owns this. We did a Sip, Souls, and Strolls recently out at the cemetery, and she was the one who put most of that material together. So I know a lot of people like to give me credit for that, but I always like to give credit where credit is due. And then here is the image where you want to snap this. There's quite a few books that you can get on the subject, but there is no book that is comprehensive, okay? You get a book, you get 25 to 50 images. You get another book, you get some other 25 to 50 images. There is no comprehensive book. And remember that an image can mean one thing to one people's and something to another. So you always want to marry your iconography with your genealogy.